All that a man might do, he had done with his 5,000 cavalrymen against the 30,000 knights, archers, and spearmen of the conspirators. Robert E. Howard. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I'm your host. First of all, I want to thank you all for joining me, and for those of you that weren't aware or are new, during October, I like to take a little bit of a break and do some episodes on fantasy or horror, kind of like with a historical focus, or like semi-historical settings, or borrowed from historical times. And this gives me a little bit more time to do research for the actual historical episodes, and still give you guys some content. Now this year is going to be a little bit different. I've been a bit ahead of my research, and I'll be putting out another historical episode during this period. Of course, this is being recorded after the finale for Europe this season. So you'll get at least one America's episode this month, and 5 bonus episodes. And I'd already meant to have this one out last week after the Britain and Ireland episode. However, I had some issues just getting the time to record. So this one will be out on Monday the 9th as normal. And then I will try to get 2 out next week. And then that way we'll be set essentially for the month. We'll be on track and on schedule. So, I hope you all enjoy it, but I understand this may not be for everyone, so listen to what interests you, and if you're maybe bored waiting for the history to come back, maybe expand your horizons. Listen to one of these and see what you think. But anyway, on with the episode, and as you might have guessed, to start this season, we're going to, these bonus episodes, we're going to talk about one of the more popular subjects I covered last year, and that is Robert E. Howard's Conan the Cimmerian, or Conan the Barbarian. Now, I recommend you do go back and listen to that episode if you haven't yet. You'll get some background on Howard, because this episode is going to be more focused on the actual world and the specific story that I quoted from earlier. And that story is the Scarlet Citadel. Now, this was first published in January of 1933, which makes it the second Conan story published in Weird Tales magazine. However, this was actually written after the next published Conan story, which is The Tower of the Elephant, which was released in March of 1933. And it may have actually been 2 or 3 stories after the Tower of the Elephant. He wrote quite a few kind of at once, and he'd send them to the editors, and they kind of make suggestions, and he would change stuff around. So some were written before others, so they're not published in a chronological order. Now, the Scarlet Citadel follows the original published story, which is The Phoenix on the Sword, and that was published in December of 1932. Now, it's hard to place the chronological order of the events of Conan's life, like in universe. But this, excuse me, sorry, my computer just gave me a notification. But both of this first 2 stories follow an older, middle-aged barbarian, and it is definitely set after Phoenix on the Sword. The Scarlet Citadel, is set after the Phoenix on the Sword. This is very easy to tell because Conan also mentions a foe that appeared in Phoenix on the Sword that he had defeated. So he harkens back to someone he had killed in the last story in this one. So he had mentioned he had defeated that man. Also in that story, he had only recently become King of Aquilonia after killing the former king, Numidides, by strangling him on his throne. Now, Numidides was a tyrant, and Conan had been one of the many mercenaries and sellswords that that he had been hired to, or that Numenides had hired to defend himself and his hold on power and the kingdom at large. And I won't spoil much of that story, as I might do an episode on one day, but there are several recurring themes in these early stories. And, obviously they do show up throughout Conan's adventures. And first, though, I do want to talk a little bit more about Conan, his people, and the kingdom that he is ruling in this story. Now, as I mentioned before, he is a Cimmerian, who were an actual historical people. Howard imagines them as a hill people that raid the great and decadent kingdoms of Hyboria, while also selling their skills to said kingdoms, those kingdoms' nobles, wizards, and of course, always fighting one another. Now, in actual history, the Cimmerians do eventually enter the historical record by traveling through mountains like the Caucasus and the Balkans, but they probably actually emerged along the Pontic-Caspian steppe. And they settled in a number of places filled with hills, where they were recorded by the literate societies. So it is this description that Howard's used as the basis for Conan's origin. Of course, in Howard's mythos, the historical Cimmerians are merely descendants of Conan's people who never left their life in the wilderness to move to the cities of the Hyborian Age that will eventually be, struck down in various calamities and famines and all that kind of stuff. Howard was of the opinion that the Cimmerians were probably the Proto-Indo-Europeans that eventually moved into Europe and those kind of places. However, as we'll get to when we actually study that time frame, that is not widely accepted at all. Now, at the time, it may have been kind of that pop science, but they are not in the listing currently by any real scholar on the subject. There are many others who... there are many other peoples put forward by scholars who are the actual Proto-Indo-Europeans, but we'll dive more into that again later. Now, Conan's name, by the way, is of course a historical name. It can be either a surname or a given name, but both versions come from the Irish branch of Celtic, the old Irish version being something close to Conan, which is theorized to come from the Proto-Celtic word ku, which is thought to have been from the Proto-Indo-European quo, meaning dog. All those words mean dog, essentially. Now, Aquilonia, the kingdom that Conan rules, is an amalgamation of several Western European cultures that don't obviously really emerge until well after our Iron Age. Now, Howard is very big on the idea that men have kind of an ancestral memory, and they're always trying to reclaim some aspect or aspects of their past. And they do this in cycles, in a similar way that civilizations rise and fall. They'll want the gleaming spires and prosperity that cities bring, but then they'll begin to wish for the savage freedom and rough honor of kind of the uncivilized barbarian. And these barbarian peoples will, of course, move into these civilized places. They'll mix, and that will kind of bring the civilization down, but also give it a new kind of vitality. And then eventually they'll, again, form this cyclical cycle of civilized and uncivilized life. And new peoples will break off, some wanting the civilization, some wanting the wilderness and the more nomadic lifestyle. Excuse me. Now, the name Aquilonia has a double meaning. It can be connected to the Latin Aquila, which means eagle, or it can be linked to the Latin Aquilo, which means north wind. The term Hyboria that is used to describe Conan's time is from the Greek for northern lands. And some of the earlier writings that Howard made about the era also use the term Hyperborea, which means beyond the north wind. This he later standardized to Hyboria, though Hyperborea itself remains a region in the world. And several historical cities have been called Aquilonia. The most famous example, of course, can be found in southern Italy. Now, there are several maps presented by modern enthusiasts and students of Howard's work that try to place everything together. And there isn't a lot of agreement, but most I have seen place Aquilonia somewhere between France, Spain, and those regions, which Aquitaine, of course, being historically a separate kingdom from France. It's in southern Gaul. We'll talk about, again, the naming divisions of how France is named and kind of divided internally later. But Aquitaine can be like basically the southern half of France. But in the Hyborian Age, the Mediterranean and the Adriatic seas don't exist. Or at least if they do exist, they're probably just very large lakes. Instead, the basin where the Mediterranean is now is filled with a lot of fertile river valleys. So obviously you imagine at the end of the Hyborian Age, the sea floods into the Mediterranean. Of course, this wipes out a lot of the big important city-states in that region, and it changes the landscape drastically into what we would imagine our modern world. So there is basically a lot more land between Spain and France and of course Italy. That's all land essentially. At least that's the most common version of the map you'll see. Essentially, Europe and Africa are connected. By and large, there are, of course, some mountains and things kind of separating other parts, but it's very different from our world. Now, several other realms are mentioned in this story, some of which are mentioned in later stories, and some are places that we will see Conan adventure in. However, two of the other realms mentioned play a central part in this tale. The first is the kingdom of Ophir, is to Aquilonia's north and east. These people are maybe ancestors to the Etruscans or possibly the Samnites of our modern world. Then you have the kingdom or empire of Koth, and this appears to be ancestor groups of Greeks and other like Anatolian peoples. And possibly also the ancient Balkans and also maybe even Sicilians. Or at least that is what Howard would have understood these people to be. Obviously, we'll talk about it, but his ideas of where people are coming from are skewed because, again, he's just following the popular science of the time. He doesn't have the benefit that we know of how humans migrated and that type of thing. Now, of course, he obviously embellished all of these semi-historical ideas, to create a vivid and exciting world of sword and sorcery. Now, Ophir is led by a man known as Amalrus. Koth is led nominally by Strabonus, who wears the crown and is assisted in this task by notorious wizard Tsohta-lanti. Now, this story is a pretty wild mix of genres. It starts with Conan fighting against brutal odds, against betrayal with his men at his side, his soldiers. Then it becomes a survival tale with Conan alone and facing not only some of his past deeds from his adventuring days, but also an extremely hostile environment. And then it becomes, in some places, while dealing with this hostile environment, a horror story. Conan has to deal with monstrous animals, in some cases demonic forces, or strange Lovecraft-esque villains, or not villains, but creatures. He deals with a tree whose roots go all the way to hell. And Conan, of course, deals with all of these things in a fairly similar manner. And of course, I mentioned last season, but Howard was a very big fan of Lovecraft's work. They did communicate several times via letters. There's definitely a lot of the old one, ancient horror stories that at least lend names of places to Conan's world, though Howard does not lean quite as hard on the cosmic horror to the point that it's driving Conan insane, like the way that most of Lovecraft's protagonists are. Now, I don't want to give too much away about the story, but I highly recommend you read this one. It's very good. Conan is still kind of developing as a character in some ways. He's not quite as fun in this one as he is in some of the later stories where he's a freewheeling adventurer. And that, obviously, this being an earlier story, Howard's still kind of getting the feel for him, but, it kind of makes sense. Conan is more mature in these stories. That's not to say, of course, that he is not a fun character, but he definitely has his wit, and it's very laconic. It's not he is not necessarily a deep thinker, at least not when talking to most people. He doesn't come across that way. He's very straightforward. He says what he thinks, and sometimes he doesn't necessarily put a lot of thought into his responses. He just says what he feels. But that's not to say Conan is dumb. Even younger Conan, he's not. He might be naive or unknowledgeable about places, but he hears things. He knows stories, rumors. He keeps his ears out. He does learn from his kind of environment, and that serves him well as king. Now, when we talk about Conan as a king, and as a character, he is very much of the mind that when he sees power, he didn't do it to protect the kingdom or these people. These are not his people. He didn't really have all these noble ideas. He sees the crown because Numidides was a very bad king and a very bad boss from the sound of things. And, if Conan didn't do it, probably someone else was. Conan sees the crown because he could. And he's very, he recognizes this fact. He does not have any illusions about his magnanimity or his goodness, as it were. But, that being said, Conan does feel like, or at least Howard, does point out in kind of the narration of the story, that, Conan wearing the crown does, Conan wants to be a good king, at least in terms of this world. It's a very brutal kingship that you need to be. To be a good king in this world, you have to be willing to fight. You have to be willing to kill. You need to be able to wage war and defend yourself in equal measure. And Conan, again, he wants to be a good ruler. He doesn't want to just plunder the country, just be a tyrant. He does kind of want to prove himself, I think. He has a very real desire to show these quote-unquote more civilized men, just what it means to be an actual, ruler, a king. And at least if you're to believe Conan's boasting, he has put an end to a lot of the civil struggles, or at least the open civil struggles in Aquilonia. His policies are very well liked by the people. He even says straight up that no people in the world are as taxed as lowly as his. So he has a good kind of grasp of the situation. But But that being said, Conan is not one to sit on his laurels. He is planning military operations in his mind. He does have plans to expand Aquilonia's frontiers, defeat its enemies. That's part of the reason that he is in battle at the start of this story. He is trying to prevent Koth from seizing Ophir, because that would give Koth a much larger border with Aquilonia. So he kind of takes a proactive role, and he's there by request of Amalric, the king of Ophir. So he is tactical. He is diplomatic. At least when it comes to fighting, he has a very real sense of what needs to be done. He's no one's fool, essentially, despite his rough upbringing and his lack of any kind of formal education. But Conan's teacher is very much the streets and the wilderness, as it were. Also, while dealing with all the kind of worldly politics of being a king, you also kind of get a feel for how Conan deals with the more supernatural elements of this world. He does not trust wizards one bit. He understands that they serve their purpose, but he is very mistrustful of all things magical, and to a certain extent most things religious. Though he's not an atheist by any means, he is at least agnostic of the gods' designs and roles. He certainly believes they exist, but he takes a very dim view of how at least the civilized world kind of makes use of the religious orders and things like that. Which is a little weird, because in the first story, it's kind of a big deal. The Phoenix on the Sword. Conan gets help from a sage, or a long dead sage, basically comes to Conan in a dream and gives him an enchantment on his sword to defeat a dark creature or entity that's stalking his castle, and gives him warning of a plot against his life. Spoilers again for the Phoenix on the Sword. But he does understand, at least for the good gods, quote unquote, that they have a purpose. Though he himself does not put much stock in else's role. He's very much I am me, and I'm going to do what I'm going to do, and I'll get through whatever I have to deal with by my own skills and power and all that kind of things. And another very interesting fact about Conan as a character, I can't help but think, and I think if you read this you might agree, that Conan is very much an Achilles-esque figure, Achilles from the Iliad. Achilles, of course, is well known for his righteous fury, his anger, his rage. That is, of course, what the Iliad is about. Homer talks about the rage of Achilles, and very early on in the Iliad, and all of the kind of the dangers and horrors that brings. Conan is very much a rage-filled man as well. Though his rage is a little bit different from Achilles. It's not quite an all-consuming rage that makes him kind of go just kind of disregard everything. Conan's rage is very much a instinctual thing. It sharpens his mind. It focuses his fighting abilities, which are already prolific. And he is very much helped by his rage. Now, of course, when he is raging, he does not quite take as much care of himself as you might expect, and it does cause him problems, injuries, and things like that. His anger can get him into trouble, but more times than not, Conan's rage is very much his getting out of trouble mode. Sorry, I was going through my notes again. Yeah, so Also, in this, you get a very good sense of Conan's political philosophy, at least when it comes to monarchies and governments. Conan is very much in the camp, it's better to win a kingdom than inherit it. He takes a very dim view of the other kings mentioned in this story, Amalric and the King of Ophir. Amalric is the King of Ophir. The King of Koth, Strabonus. He is not very respectful of them, at least in terms of their kingship. He says that he fought and bled for his crown, whereas they, the only thing they had to do to win their crowns was poison a few brothers, essentially. While their fathers, of course, won the crowns, the only exercise they got from it was poisoning again their brothers. Now, this is a little bit longer of the Conan stories. It's around 15,000 words. I think most of them clock in around 8 to 11,000, give or take. So this one actually has a little bit more depth to it. But that being said, of course, because of the length and that this is appearing in like a serial magazine, there is some plot elements that if these were full novels, I'm sure that he would have paced them out a little better. There's a lot of Conan gets to place, event happens, exposition happens, and then the next event takes place. And it kind of happens a lot in a lot of the Conan stories. There's a lot of repeats. There's some stuff that is, in my opinion, fairly obvious, but then Howard explains because, of course, younger kids are reading these stories too, despite the violence and all that kind of stuff. There's definitely a lot of telling rather than showing, though. Again, it's interesting stuff, and again, there's a nice mix of genre here. There's swashbuckling elements. There are, of course, large-scale battles that are being described, and actually, Howard does a really great job of painting the picture of a battlefield and what is happening. And he's very drawn, you can tell, to, or draws a lot of inspiration from battle narratives historically of how things happened. But yeah, so I highly recommend the Scarlet Citadel as a story. Even if you're not in necessarily to the sword and sorcery genre, it's a good one because it you get a lot of flavor with this. There's a lot of different elements here. Like if you're okay with big battle scenes, you've got great things to choose from here. If you're good for kind of this claustrophobic exploration and horror elements, that's a good portion of this story, right in the middle. And Conan himself, he is he is never deterred by what he deals with. There's never a sense that he thinks he's going to fail. Conan doesn't feel fear like a normal human. I'm sure he does feel it. Sometimes this is instinctual fear, just on his situation. But by and large, Conan's like, you know what? I'm just going to deal with this as best I can, and I'm going to come out on top. And that, that is something that a lot of characters, don't necessarily do in a lot of stories these days. At least in my opinion. And sometimes that's a good thing. Conan can be a little too, powerful in certain situations. But, he does get into trouble. He does make mistakes. It's just none of this ever deters him. He knows he's going to come out on top. There's not much of a romance element in this story. A lot of the early Conan stories, there is no female lady of the week or the month or whatever. That's something that shows up in some of the middle kind of Conan stories. A lot of the early ones are just about the adventure and the fighting and that kind of stuff, which, they all kind of had their elements. Though Conan does kind of wax poetic at times about the ladies in his harem. Not to any specific one, of course, but he does hate the idea of someone taking his crown and, taking his women hostage or taking them from him, because, they like him and he likes them, at least as far as he can tell. So he very much does want to protect those close to him. And I mean that in a way of subjects. He doesn't really have any friends as king. He has people he trusts. He has advisors that he, at least understands will be loyal while he is alive. That they do accept him as king because he is the best man for the job. But yeah, I should say that there are some elements that are a little outdated. Again, Howard isn't nearly as bad as Lovecraft in terms of like racial stuff. Howard is very much, a man of his time, but he is not explicitly like, all brown people are beneath the white Conan. Conan has, of course, adventures with other people from what is now Africa and India, or at least the ancestors of those people. He does fight plenty of those people on occasion, but it's not exclusive. Conan is Conan, and he fights anyone and everyone who gets in his way. But he also, of course, has allies on occasion. From these places where, Howard understood them to be the ancestors of people from places that were colonized by Europeans. That is not to say that there is not some, stereotypical treatment of those people or people like those people from modern day parts of the world. And that is an unfortunate element, but it is not necessarily egregious. I think that's more like, again, it's kind of the crap popular science that some people were really into in the 20s and 30s. But that's not so much in this story too much. That is not something that you have to deal with in the Scarlet Citadel. There is someone who is from Conan's past as a pirate captain. Conan had fought the man and his brother, and the man is very much kind of consumed by his need for revenge from Conan. But he does not... He has Conan very much at a disadvantage. Very much in this story. Conan... And this leads into another thing. Conan's also very lucky. Despite his skills and his his wit, his cleverness, his trickster nature in some situations, Conan is also extremely lucky. It's several parts in several of these stories. But sometimes you gotta be. But Conan would say, luck is luck. But if he, even if he was the luckiest man alive, if he still wasn't strong and fast and a good fighter, all the luck in the world wouldn't save him for most of these situations. But he definitely lucks out a couple of times. There's not quite any direct Deus Ex Machina from some of these stories. Now there are some characters who help him they make him the Deus Ex Machina. But there's very few things where it's just like out of the blue, Conan is saved for no reason whatsoever. In fact, sometimes I feel like some of his challenges come out from the middle of nowhere. But yeah, I highly recommend these Conan stories, Scarlet Citadel especially. But yeah, I hope you all have enjoyed. I know this is a little bit of a shorter episode. But yeah, I think this is a good place to stop it. And we will be back next week. I haven't determined which episode I'm going to do next first. I've been working on kind of the scripts, quote-unquote scripts. I kind of do this, obviously, by the fly. See my pants. But I do have notes. So I have been kind of collating some notes for a couple of different stories. I don't know which one I'm going to do next. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed. Please, if you have any feedback or questions or constructive criticism, do not hesitate to let me know. You can reach me via direct message on Twitter or X. I'll include a link to my page there. You can, of course, comment on any of my YouTube videos, or you can send me an email to waradrevpod@gmail.com. That's WARAD REVPOD@gmail.com. And yeah, I hope you all have had a good weekend, and I hope you have a good rest of your week. Obviously, if you've been following the news, there's a lot going on, especially in the Middle East with Israel and Hamas and Palestine and several other countries in the region. Hopefully, there's already a fairly sizable death toll. Hopefully it will not get much larger, and that there can be some kind of peaceful settlement, but that's not looking likely. Obviously, very important historical sites in the region for a number of different peoples. So I hope, in addition to the limitation of modern day infrastructure and, of course, civilian life, I hope these historical sites can be spared as well. But we will, of course, be having to keep an eye on all that. So if you are of the mind, I certainly hope the region and its peoples are in your thoughts and prayers. But hopefully that will not get too much worse. So again, thank you all. Thank you for joining me. I hope you'll return, and I will see you all next time. Have a good day. Goodbye.